Today on Blue 58, no position group on the Packers faces higher expectations than wide receivers. Is that fair? Probably not. Is that justified? Very yes.
Blue 58!
Hello and welcome to another episode of Blue 58, the one and only podcast of thepowersweep.com. I'm your host, John Meerdink, and I'm happy to be with you here for another episode, because it's going to be the last episode for a couple weeks. Next week, we're going to be off completely. We've got a family trip coming up, so we'll be heading out of town on Sunday. So I'll be on the road and unable to record next week. So no podcast next week, but we'll be back starting the week of the 15th to get you ready for the start of training camp the following week. They'll be coming fast and furious after we get back because we have to make up for a little bit of lost time as we do some position previews here, but don't want you to be surprised by the lack of podcast next week because there aren't going to be anyway. Anyhow, wide receivers. These previews that we're doing for position-by-position stuff tend to center on expectations. And I think high expectations for a group can kind of skew expectations for the individuals. And I think we don't see that anywhere more clearly on the Packers roster than the wide receiver room as a whole. So let me explain a little bit what I was trying to get at in the opening line of this podcast. It's not really fair to the wide receivers that the expectations on them are this high, because individually there's almost no chance that anybody's going to be able to carry this room by himself. But individually, there's also a good reason to be optimistic about all these guys and what they could mean together. As a unit, there's no position, I think, on this roster where your expectations should be higher because they're the deepest. The talent ceiling might be the highest here, though unrealized largely. I mean, we're not as close to being maximum wide receiver as we are to saying, I don't know, maybe maximum edge rusher. The edge group might not be as deep as the wide receivers, but the top end is probably closer to their ceiling than the top end wide receivers. That seems fair to say. But overall, having these high expectations can make it hard to drill down and think about what we should think for individual guys here. I am reminded of where the Packers were in 2016 when we just started this podcast. One of the first episodes we did was about how many wide receivers the Packers should keep. And the big discussion in 2016 training camp was, do the Packers keep 7 wide receivers or maybe more, because we just have so many good ones in camp right now that, well, would it make sense to cut any of them? Do we just keep all 10? Do we keep 12 receivers? There's just so many good receivers that we have. And in reality, that group was it was pretty good to okay to pretty good. Maybe say it the other way. You had post-ACL Jordy Nelson, Davante Adams pre-ascension, 2016, especially toward the middle portion of that year is where he really started to take off. Ty Montgomery before he switches to running back. Randall Cobb is there. You've also got Trevor Davis and Jeff Janis and Geronimo Allison. Jared Abbrederis was kicking around. So the question, how many receivers do you keep, was kind of predicated on this idea of all these guys being good. And as you see there, most of those guys end up being fair to middling at best. I mean, outside of Jordy Nelson, even post-ACL, and Davante Adams, there wasn't a lot to write home about there. Randall Cobb wasn't great in 2016, though certainly better than everybody else in this group that we're mentioning. Ty Montgomery was just okay at receiver, so he ends up as a running back. Trevor Davis never really amounted to much. Jeff Janis was more of an idea than a player. Geronimo Allison, basically the sort of guy that you're shuffling in and out every year, and he ends up sticking around for a while. And I may even be misremembering 2016. I didn't even look it up. This was off the top of my head. Allison may not even have been around that year. But the point is, high expectations as a position group can make it seem like some guys are having worse seasons than they actually are. So coming into our discussion about wide receivers, I kind of want to have that sort of mindset as we talk about this room. Because this year I think is deeper than a season like 2016. And as a group, I think these guys can be special. The strengths of the group, though, could make individual performances look a little bit diminished. Just with the amount of talent the Packers have at receiver, 1 through 6, 7, 8, wherever you want to draw the line, you're going to end up losing out on stats and reps and opportunities just because you'll end up spreading things out so much. That is a strength of the roster and of this wide receiver room for sure, but I think it's also a threat to individual productivity and things like that. But it's also close to the ideal. If you're building a roster, this is what you want to end up with. This is what you want to have. You'd love to have everyone be able to contribute, and that, I think, is what the Packers do have. But it does exist in tension with the individual goals and trajectories that these guys have. If you're hoping for a big money free agent contract down the road, you're going to want to be able to get as many opportunities between now and whenever that contract is to show what you're worth. So Jayden Reed over the next 3 years is going to want to have as many opportunities as he can to get as big a contract as he can when he's a free agent. Christian Watson over the next 2 years. Romeo Doubs over the next 2 years. Dontavian Wicks over the next 3 years. And on and on and on it goes. So how long will the Packers wide receiver group be able to exist in that tension? I don't know, but it's also not something I'm worried about for a couple of reasons. First, this is going to solve itself eventually. Guys will either move on or be moved on, and you'll end up with the receiver room that you have, just by the contractual reality here. I'm also not worried about it because of the makeup of the guys in this room. I mean, I don't claim to know any of these guys, but just from the outside looking in, does anyone in that receiver room strike you as someone who's going to nuke the chemistry of the team just because they want a bigger contract, more opportunities? It doesn't seem like they've got a complainer in the room. Not even to use the term that I guess is common talking about this position group, the diva wide receiver. There doesn't seem to be one in that room. And on top of that, or maybe the bottom line of all that, the roles are also going to change due to performance or availability. Guys that perform well or better than others are going to get more opportunities, and they'll take away opportunities from guys that aren't performing as well. And then there's also the ever-present reality of injuries. It's great to say, look, we've got Christian Watson and Jayden Reed and Dontavian Wicks and Romeo Doubs and Bo Melton and Malik Heath and Grant DuBose and Samori Toure and all these undrafted guys. We got 11 receivers we like right now. That's fine in July, where we are now. By October, you're not going to be able to keep all those guys. The ones that you do keep are probably not going to be completely healthy. Chances are someone's going to get dinged up, and we're not even talking about recurring injury issues like we've seen with Christian Watson. It's just the nature of the game. Guys are going to get beat up. It happened to Romeo Doubs for things that were out of his control. It happens to everybody. People get hurt, and it's going to change what this room looks like. So opportunities will change and roles will change. And overall, I just want to keep in mind that these guys are going to have different levels of expectations that may not be able to even be reached just because of the other strengths in this room. So we're going to try to temper predictions and things like that accordingly. I think it's kind of a squishy thing, and I don't like necessarily doing previews this way, but most of the wide receiver room is going to come down to vibes. Like, we know that this is a talented room. We know that there's a lot of talented players here. It's just, how do you feel about the makeup of the group now, a quarter of the way through the season, halfway through the season, heading into the playoffs? How do you feel about how it's all shaking up? How do you feel about what they're doing together? That's really what it amounts to. The talent level is almost immaterial because as a group, unless they get really hammered by injuries, and sometimes that happens, they should have enough talent to make things go no matter who is on the field. That's really not the issue. It's just kind of how it all shakes out together. Now, before we get specific, I want to remind people that we do have our Patreon-specific merch that is available to people who support us on Patreon. Unfortunately, that's not something that we can offer directly through Substack, though if you choose to support us there, that is something you can get. But we've had our first wave of Patreon-specific merch go out all over the world. People, I think as far away as Sweden, have been getting stuff from us through the mail, not me directly, but through their Patreon sponsorships. and choosing to support us there, that's something that you can have. Patreon.com/thepowersweep. Choose to support us at one of the levels at which you get something. Unfortunately, you can't offer it at every level. So if you support for $1 per month, unfortunately, Patreon won't allow us to do something because they say you'll be taking too big of a loss on the merch. That really doesn't bother me. I would do it anyway. But if you support at the $3 level or higher, you can get specific things sent directly to you. No muss, no fuss. It'll just come 3 months from now. So consider that. Join us in the Discord if you do support there, and just continue to help us do what we're doing here. And we appreciate everybody who chooses to do just that. We are coming up on our 8-year anniversary, heading into year 9 of the Power Sweep, and I'm just excited to be here, and I'm grateful for everybody who chooses to support. The receivers in particular are fun to look into. And just how it shakes out this year, even with as many guys as they have on the roster, there's almost nobody for whom we have no expectations. And it's just a pretty short list, starting with Julian Hicks and Dimitri Stanley, both 2024, undrafted free agents. Hicks out of Albany, good athlete with pretty good size, about 6'1", 200 pounds or so. If I was betting on a low roster guy to make a move, he'd be it. He's not that far ahead of Dimitri Stanley, though, 6 foot 200 pounds. Played some pretty high-level college football at Colorado and Iowa State, so not one of the big boys there, but was fairly productive at Colorado, then had some, it looks like, at least if you believe his dad's telling him the story, and dads may not be entirely objective about their sons, but his dad seemed to suggest that there were some internal politicking sort of things that prevented his son from getting more opportunities from Iowa State. His dad, of course, had a cup of coffee with the Packers in the 1980s. Maybe his son can follow in his footsteps. And then outside of Hicks and Stanley, you've got Alex Magoo. I put him in the no expectations group just because, well, he's switching over from wide receiver. The position change move is the let's try some experimental treatment stage of your NFL career kind of going terminal. And that's maybe a needlessly grim way to look at it. But if you're switching positions, the next thing is switching professions is usually how that goes, because if they're trying to figure out something that you can do that isn't the position you came in the league doing, you're probably not long for the NFL at that point. And that's why I'm really not concerned, but watching closely the talk of A.J. Dillon doing some fullback type things or H-back type things. Those are the sort of things that come up when it's just about time to be done. And if you wouldn't be doing that if you were getting the job done at your original position. So just bear that in mind as we look at guys like Alex Magoo and other guys who might be switching positions. Every time I've seen it happen with the Packers, it's usually been about not too long before you end up on the outside looking in. Ty Montgomery is really the only recent success story, and even he really ended up going more the wide receiver route after he left Green Bay than sticking with the primarily running back route where he was in Green Bay. Anyway, the low expectations group. Couple guys here, starting with Grant DuBose, 2023 7th-round pick, a basically redshirt season last year. After an injury early in training camp, put him behind the 8-ball developmental-wise. Did play quite a bit on special teams in the preseason last year. I'm not sure how much that matters anymore. The Packers have kind of gone away from receivers on special teams under Rich Bisaccia, and the change in kickoff rules, I mean, it's anybody's guess how that's going to affect roster construction, but it was a tough start to his NFL career, and accordingly his expectations are low, I think, heading into this year. I don't think we can put him in no expectations, but he's pretty close there, just because of the depth chart ahead of him and where he is development-wise. He's going to be part of the battle royale after the top 4. Conventional wisdom, and I think just anybody with eyes would say your top 4 are in some order: Christian Watson, Jaden Reed, Dontavian Wicks, and Romeo Doubs. All those guys are making the roster. They are in. I would say it's an absolute lock for every single one of those guys. And beyond that, we've got a real knife fight. You've got Grant DuBose, Samori Toure, Malik Heath, and Bo Melton in some order as well. I think Heath and Melton are firmly ahead of DuBose and Toure, but not that far ahead that DuBose or Toure couldn't make a run. And DuBose is very much a part of that conversation. I think to meet expectations this year, he's just got to do that, be competitive. And if he does that, I think he'll be around in some form in 2024, probably on the practice squad. I don't really foresee any of the no expectation guys beating him out this summer. So I think if he's got a route to the roster, it's going to be getting to the practice squad and just waiting things out from there. It might be disappointing to be on the practice squad again, but at least you're in the conversation at that point. And I think DuBose is going to make the most of that and end up on the practice squad again. That is a contrast to Samori Toure, whose expectations, I would say, are slightly higher than Grant DuBose, but I am significantly less confident that he will meet them. He was a 2022 seventh-round pick, flashed a little bit as a rookie, but then was surpassed as a sophomore by both Malik Heath and Bo Melton. Low expectations for Toure because just look at the depth chart ahead of him. 2 second-round picks in Watson and Reed. Love's main sidekick in Romeo Doubs, last year's breakout player in Dontavian Wicks, and then right there with him is Bo Melton, who had a very exciting end to 2023, and Malik Heath, who was last year's undrafted free agent success story. And then right behind him is Grant DuBose, who's probably a more athletic version of Samori Toure. That's a tough spot to be in. So he's got one objective for this year: survive. He's got to find a way to get probably to the practice squad and ahead of these other guys, Heath, Melton, DuBose, to make it to that spot. That's a tough ask, I think, at this point for Toure, and I don't think he's going to make it. I think my prediction for Toure is that he's done in Green Bay. I think the practice squad will be Grant DuBose more than likely, and then somebody else either from this training camp group or outside the organization. I think Toure is about done here, and if he gets cut at the end of training camp, I would probably look for his agent to steer him somewhere other than Green Bay at this point as well. The moderate expectations group starts with Malik Heath. A nice surprise last year. Was very productive in college and fell to the Packers as an undrafted free agent, essentially because he didn't test very well, is not an elite athlete in the context of other elite athletes. But I think if he had not actually produced when he got the chance last year, he'd be in basically the same camp as Samori Toure and Grant DuBose. He's not that different from them physically, a little bit heavier, to be sure. But production-wise, it took him a little while to get going last year. He flashed in the preseason, but over the first 10 weeks of the season last year, he had 5 targets in the 5 games in which he appeared with 0 catches. Finally got a catch on target number 6. A bit of a historical outlier there, as we noted at times last year. But he did finally get over the hump and ended up having a fairly productive year for what he was. Moderate expectations, though, a little bit ahead of Samori Toure development-wise, and I think has an inside track at a roster spot just because he's what I would call the gooniest wide receiver the Packers have right now, maybe along with Dontavian Wicks. But he's the closest version of the big body wide receiver archetype that Matt LaFleur seems to have wanted since he got to Green Bay. You had Allen Lazard before Heath. Heath is, I think, the heir to that sort of role, the big physical, not pass blocking, run blocking receiver who will clean your clock downfield if he has to. He and Wicks both are big, rugged guys, and they fit that role better than anyone else on the roster. So I think that's how he makes the roster, if there is a path to the roster for him, and I think there is. Just be that sort of guy. So he's got to take some steps forward from last year naturally. Production-wise, that might be hard, but the rest, just getting more involved in stuff, is very doable. And for him, it's really about filling a role more than anything else. So if he is the gooniest wide receiver, he's just got to be that Matt LaFleur goon. He's got to be the enforcer, the cleanup guy. He will probably never be a priority in the offense, at least not this season. But he can do the dirty work. He can block for you. He can catch a couple of tough passes. And I think he is going to get all the opportunities to do that. I think he makes the 53. I think he ends up having more than 150 but fewer than 300 receiving yards this year. Pretty wide range there, to be sure. But I think he gets on the field, he does produce, and he has a nice little season filling that role. Speaking of nice little season, how about Bo Melton last year? Long road to get to that late season explosion, but fun to follow along the way. 2022 7th-round pick, one pick after the Packers selected Tariq Carpenter, who is no longer with the team. He ended up in Green Bay in late 2022 to fill a roster spot created by Dean Lowry going to injured reserve, and of course blossomed late last year. Melton is one of my favorite, not quite trivia facts, but if you look toward the end of the 2022 NFL draft, you have Luke Tenuta going with pick 209 to the Buffalo Bills. Tariq Carpenter going at 228 to the Packers, Melton going 229 to the Seahawks, and then Jonathan Ford going to the Packers on pick number 234. Just a lot of clustering there of guys that the Packers liked, and they end up getting all four of those guys into Green Bay at some point. I wonder if there's anybody else in that range that the Packers have shown interest in over the years. None of the names are jumping out to me, but I just think it's interesting how sometimes you see clusters like that where the Packers end up taking another look at guys around where they were already picking. I wonder, had Luke Tenuta been available for the Tariq Carpenter pick, would they have taken him there? I tend to think yes, but you never know. But all that to say, for Melton, moderate expectations. He, like Heath, has something to build on. He has very different tools than Malik Heath does, but he has something to build on from last year, and I think it would be disappointing to see him on the practice squad or out of Green Bay entirely, given what we saw from him last year. But he's kind of got the same deal, I think, as Samori Toure in that he's got to survive. Of those low-roster guys, Heath, Melton, Dubose, Toure, Melton is the outlier there physically. He's the small, traditional slot receiver-looking sort of player. He's got to show, I think, a different sort of game than these other guys if he's going to make it to the roster. Last year, he showed us he could. He's just got to keep doing that again. And that is not heartbreaking, but it's the funny thing to see if you watch and track roster development enough over time. You'd understand it if guys got just burnt out on this stuff. So here's Melton. He gets drafted late in the 2022 draft, doesn't really find his feet in Seattle, gets signed to the Packers after an injury, doesn't really get on the field in 2022, survives again in 2023, makes it to the team again, finally gets an opportunity at the end of the 2023 season, and now he's basically got to start all of that over again to make the roster again. I know this is the job. I could just understand if you find yourself getting a little bit tired of that job. I think he makes the 53-man roster outright. I think statistically he has not a spectacular year, but I think he cracks 200 receiving yards and has 2 or more touchdowns. But I think he's going to be around, if only to give the Packers a little bit of physical redundancy after Jayden Reed, because Reed and Melton are really the only receivers of their kind on the roster right now. So then we end up into the high expectations group, and this is where we talk about the 4 guys that I've really laid out as I think is the 4 unquestioned top 4 of the depth chart right now. We start with Dontayvion Wicks, who became what I thought he would much sooner last year. He was the guy I predicted last year would be this guy needs more snaps guy, the guy that everybody across Packers Internet is saying, we need to see more of this guy, we need to have him on the field more. He was basically that by week 2, when the Packers were playing in Atlanta, and he did get more snaps eventually, and was an involved feature of the Packers offense down the stretch. Expectations, though, pretty high, but high in a way that I think is different from the other guys. High because he's got a lot of potential. High because he showed what he could do with that potential last year, but high in, I think, a different way than a Jayden Reed or a Christian Watson. He's not going to be one of the engines of the offense early on, but I think he will be counted on to be one eventually. The depth chart ahead of him also is not ideal, but I think it's very climbable for him. I would not at all be surprised to see him siphoning off some snaps from a guy like Romeo Doubs at some point this year. And I think I'm fairly high on Doubs, but the rub there is they just have very similar games, and I think that Wicks has a better long-term version of that game than Doubs does. He's significantly more physical than Doubs. I think he's probably a little bit faster than Doubs is. I think that he has a higher ceiling than Doubs does long-term. But in terms of meeting expectations, I think Wicks gets off a little bit easy. He basically just has to be what he was last year and let things develop around him. If the Packers decide they want to see more of him and less of Romeo Doubs, that's really not in Wicks' control as long as he's taking care of business. If they decide they want to keep him where he is, there's really not much they can do about that, or that he can do about that either, because he's just got to play the role that he's got. I think he will break 650 receiving yards this year. He will have more catches than last year, which was 39, but a lower yards per catch average. He averaged 14.9 per catch last year. I would like to see him a little bit more in that possession role. I'm not saying he can't average 15 yards per catch, but I think he's going to end up being a little bit more of a lower yards per catch guy as he gets more of the tough yards than the big explosive plays. So that brings us to Romeo Doubs, who I think is a kind of maybe not hand-in-glove sort of player with Dontavian Wicks. I think they're very similar as players. They both kind of fit that classic possession receiver archetype. Neither of them is the get deep, take the top off the defense sort of guy. Though I think both of them can in the right circumstances. They just don't have the explosive, like, bolt of lightning downfield speed that you would typically expect from that. And I'm really satisfied with where Doubs is heading into year 3. It's been kind of an up and down road to get here. Is he the most efficient receiver? No. Is he very explosive? Not particularly. But crucially, did he get to play the role that he's supposed to last year? Very much yes. Doubs has always struck me as a complementary receiver. He's the guy who's going to take advantage of your number 2, number 3 defensive or receivers or defensive backs. That's what I'm going for. He plays receiver. He's being guarded by defensive backs. He's the guy that will beat up on those guys just because he's crafty and smart and knows how to probe out those soft spots in the defense. That's a tough skill set to translate to being someone who gets more attention or more snaps than they necessarily should. And I think that's where he was through a lot of his first year and a half in the NFL. He was playing a bigger role than he probably should have due to injury, and that, I think, worked against him because that's not an ideal role for him to be in. He's the sort of receiver that I think early Patriots career, Bill Belichick would have really targeted in some ways as a defensive mind. So one of the things that Bill Belichick always liked to do, not always, but in particular situations, he would put his best defensive back on a team's number 2 receiver, because that way he could spend the rest of his resources on defense, shutting down the team's top receiver. So if you've got, let's say, 6 guys in your secondary who are going to be between your linebackers and your safeties and your cornerbacks, 6 guys that are going to be involved in coverage on a game-to-game basis. Belichick saw it as you could spend a little bit of resources to make sure that their second most dangerous receiver was done. Put your best guy on him and make sure he gets wiped out. And then you spend the other 5 of those 6 guys that you've got devoted to the secondary really shutting down that number 1 guy. That seems like a good way to go about it a lot of times, and it worked pretty well for Belichick. He's going to go down as one of the great coaches of all time because of approaches like that. Doubs seems like the sort of guy that Belichick would pay a lot of attention to, because I think as we saw down the stretch last year against the Cowboys, against the 49ers, if you forget about him, he will make you pay because he's smart. He's got a great connection with Jordan Love, and he knows how to put both of those things into practice. He can find places to be open. I think there's a difference there. He doesn't necessarily get open. He finds ways to be open. He reacts to the defense, I think, as well as anybody on the Packers right now, probably better than most of the guys on the Packers. And I think he's rewarded in cases like we saw against the Cowboys and 49ers in the playoffs last year. So I think that's a great place for him to be. High expectations, though. Along with Jayden Reed, I feel like he is the most known commodity of the Packers' top 4 receivers, and that brings some expectations as well. His relationship with Jordan Love on the field is also a big part of that. He's the guy who Love seems to count on to get him out of bad situations. So I think he's got to build off where he was at the end of 2023. In a lot of ways, he feels like the oldest man in the wide receiver room, just because of the way that he plays and the way that he goes about his business. He's not the flashiest wide receiver. The way that he makes his big plays seems a little bit different from the other guys. It's mostly about it's not busted coverages. It's finding ways for coverages to be busted around you, finding their breaking points and slipping into them. That, I think, is a unique skill set, and Doubs seems to have it. I think he is going to see a little bit of a statistical decline across the board, even though I think he is going to have another successful year. This is where Wicks may siphon off some stuff from him, so I think he'll have fewer catches, fewer yards, and fewer touchdowns than where he was in 2023, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. As he loses a little bit of ground maybe to Dontavian Wicks, I think he can still have a lot of success. It's going to be more about timeliness for Dobbs than about pure volume, but I think he can fill that role very, very well. 2 to go, starting with Jayden Reed. In 2023, I think he was everything we could have hoped for. He runs, he catches, he does it all. He's the gadget player that actually works. Randall Cobb was supposed to be that kind of guy. He really ended up being mostly just a very good slot receiver, a very good one, to be sure, but the gadget stuff never really worked with him. It does with Reed. Maybe he's faster, maybe he's shiftier. I'm not even sure exactly what it was. Maybe it's a more creative use for him. Randall Cobb's gadget stuff was never really all that groundbreaking. Mike McCarthy is just basically like, let's have him stand next to Aaron Rodgers in the backfield. That'll really throw everybody off. And it did, like once, and then he kept doing it after everybody had figured it out, and it kind of went downhill from there. But Reed gets used in a lot of interesting ways, and the Packers get the most out of the skills that he has. And I think this year he goes from being just the fun gadget to an important cog in the offense as a whole. What happens when you build more of your offense around that gadget? I don't know if we know that for sure, but I think that's what we're going to see with Reed this year. So he meets expectations by being the same as he was last year, only more so. Stats-wise, I think he's going to be about where he was last year, maybe a little bit more, so cracking 850 yards, cracking 75 catches, 75 or more catches. But I think just finding a way to consistently be what he was last year is going to be the path forward for Reed. I don't see any reason why he can't do it. He seems to be a really good fit with Matt LaFleur. So not a ton to say about Reed, but I think he's going to take some steps forward this year. Then we get to Christian Watson. Of the receivers on the roster, I feel pretty comfortable saying that he faces the highest expectations this year because he's heading into year 3 and we don't know exactly what he is. But we do know one thing. There's nobody on the roster that can match the best of Christian Watson. Physicality, no one can do it. No one has the dimensions that he does in the wide receiver room. He's the tallest. He's pretty close to the heaviest. What he does with those physical attributes is similarly unmatched. There's nobody who can match his production. There's nobody who can match his speed. Scott Van Pelt of ESPN, back when I used to listen to his radio show every day, would often trot out a phrase that I've come to like: "How good's your good? How good is your version of being good?" So when we say so-and-so is a good football player, Christian Watson's a good football player, Jayden Reed's a good football player, how good is the best version of Christian Watson versus the best version of Jayden Reed? It seems like a night and day comparison. There are things that Watson can do that Reed just simply cannot because of his physical skills. And we've seen it in flashes. 4-game span in 2022, 15 catches, 313 yards, 7 touchdowns. Also adds 2 carries for 49 yards and a touchdown. That rushing touchdown against the Bears, by the way, is one of my favorite recent memory Packers plays because of the added context around it. They called that play coming out of a dead ball, and they had it on the sideline, and Aaron Rodgers supposedly asked Matt LaFleur, like, do you want him to go down or score a touchdown here? And LaFleur kind of was like, what do you mean? He's like, well, he's going to score. This is going to go. What do you want him to do when he gets open? What should I tell him? And he's like, well, just put it in. Like, have him score a touchdown. And away Christian Watson went. Zoom, off for the score. I just love stuff like that because it shows the reality-bending powers that Christian Watson can have. He's a good example of a couple different phenomenons. First, just the reality of, or the truest explanation or example of calling somebody a star. Stars are in sports or media or wherever. You know what a star is. Somebody who's got a bright personality, who seems to change things around them. But I think the truest understanding of that is actually kind of cosmological. If you know how stars work in space, like they literally bend space-time around them. That, I think, is what stars are really like in sports in particular, is that they just the rules seem to work differently for them. When I was in college in Minnesota, the Minnesota Timberwolves ran this thing on Thursday nights where I think it was like $7 admission for people with a college ID. So I for a while, me and my roommate did that like almost every week for a month or two. We went to a bunch of T-Wolves games, but one week in particular we wanted to go because early career Kevin Durant was coming to town. And just the game that he had that night and the things that he did on the court always stuck in my mind because of the way in which he did them. He was doing routine things in ways that normal basketball players, even at the professional level, didn't move. There was one play, and if I get this right, or don't get it exactly right, it doesn't really matter. But from my memory, what happened was the Thunder were on defense. A shot goes up and it ricochets out to about the elbow, the free throw where the free throw line meets the lane, and Durant curls around somebody else and grabs the rebound, sort of cuffs it out of the air. So most people catch two hands. He just grabs it on the run with one hand, kind of flicks the ball ahead of him, takes two enormous steps, gathers the ball, continues to dribble, makes two dribbles to his left, crosses over, crosses midcourt, and just pulls up on the run for a three-pointer, or maybe just inside the three-point line, long two. Nothing but net. Absolutely effortless, just doing things like he's out for a walk in the park. That's a star. That's somebody who can do things and affect the game around them, the world around them, in ways that other people can't, and that's Christian Watson. He is a star. He can be a star. He may not be there yet, but he has that kind of potential. But he also kind of embodies something we've talked about before on this podcast, the curse of greatness. He has these things that nobody else has. People are expecting him to be great. The pre-draft comparison for Christian Watson was Calvin Johnson. That's absurd. You've seen Calvin Johnson play. You've seen his workouts and things like that. He is a one of one. But as we said at the time, if you're even shopping for a house in Calvin Johnson's neighborhood, athletically, you're doing pretty well for yourself. And I think Christian Watson showed us some of that as a rookie. But along with that comes expectations that are going to be almost impossible for you to meet. However good you are, people are always going to want you to be better. And now you've got people talking about how his hamstring stuff is fixed, how far along he is, how great he looks when he's healthy. And I hope all of that is true, but those expectations are hard to meet. So how does he meet high expectations this year? He does not have to be that 2022 spurt again. He doesn't have to be 313 yards in 4 games. He doesn't even have to be where he was in his best 3-game stretch from last year, 14 catches, 186 yards, and 4 touchdowns. That would be great if he could do that for an entire season. But I think expecting anybody to do that is a little bit of a fraught proposition. So he doesn't have to be that. That's not what we're looking for. I think what we are looking for is consistency, just availability maybe, but being more consistent, spreading some of that production out over the course of the season. Production to be sure, and then just general kind of vibes. Does Christian Watson feel like he has turned a corner here? Is he farther along? Is he healthier? What do we feel about all those things and what he's bringing to the offense? That's a tough one to pin down, but I think it's an important part of this. I think he can do it. I'm feeling, and maybe I get burned on this, and to be sure, we're going to have to see it first, but I think he can do it. I think we're going to see more of Christian Watson this year than we have to this point. And I think 60-plus catches and 800-plus yards is a good place for him to start. Maybe those end up being low predictions. If he's healthy the whole year, if he's at where he was physically at his very best in 2022, those might end up being really low predictions. But I think that's a good mix of conservative and a higher bar for him than we've seen in the past. I think he can get there. I think he will get there. And I think this is going to be an exciting wide receiver room this year. It already is, because we've got a lot of great stuff we can talk about. But putting it on the field, putting it into practice, that is an entirely different ball game. And we'll see what the Packers can do about that this year. and I'm very excited to watch it all play out. That's all I've got for you in this episode of Blue 58. I hope you have a great week next week, and I hope that it's not too much of an absence for you to bear. We're going to have fun. So hopefully you have fun next week. Just go outside and spend some time outside in the good weather. Things have been really nice where we are, so hopefully you have a chance to do some of that too. In the meantime, if you don't do anything else, just go ahead and share this episode with someone you think would enjoy it. That's going to help more people find the show and get more people involved in this conversation you and I are having about the Green Bay Packers, which in turn is going to help all of us, me included, become smarter Packers fans. And as I always say, smarter Packers fans are better Packers fans, and better Packers fans are what we all want to be. I'm your host, John Meerdink. We'll see you next time on Blue 58.